The federal government knows the system is collapsing. How do I know that? Because they wrote it down. 245 pages. Public document. Available to anyone. And inside that report, they buried 12 admissions that tell you exactly how bad things already are. Not how bad they could get, how bad they already are right now. Guys, when I finished reading this, I had to sit with it for a minute, because this is not a theory. This is not doom and gloom content. This is the government's own math, destroying the government's own narrative. One of my subscribers, George, used to work at the Treasury Department, and he sent this over to me. I went through every page, and I am going to walk you through everything I found today. These are their numbers, their figures, their projections. They basically made the case against themselves and then published it, hoping nobody would look. Most people have a rough idea that the debt is big and the deficit keeps growing. But I am telling you right now, by the time we get through all 12 of these, you are going to see this completely differently. Because it is not just bad, it is structurally, mathematically impossible to fix without something breaking, and the government knows it. They put it in writing. Let us get into it. Sign 1 is something that almost nobody covers the way it deserves, and that is the slow collapse of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. This is the foundation. This is the reason the United States has been able to run the kind of deficits we are about to talk about without the whole thing blowing up already. The world needs dollars. Global trade runs on them. Countries hold them in their reserves. That demand absorbs a huge amount of the punishment that would otherwise land directly on your wallet, and that buffer is getting smaller every year. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has dropped from around 71% back in 1999 down to about 58% today. Now, I know that might not sound catastrophic on the surface, but think about what that number actually represents. Central banks around the world are making deliberate decisions to hold fewer dollars. They are rotating into gold, into the euro, into currencies tied to the BRICS bloc, which keeps expanding. Over 50 countries are now settling trade with each other in currencies other than the dollar. China and Russia have been doing this for years. Saudi Arabia has been in serious discussions about pricing oil in yuan. India is buying Russian energy in rupees. The architecture for a world that does not depend on the dollar the way it used to is being built right now, not in 10 years. Right now. And here is why this hits your wallet directly. The moment the dollar loses a meaningful additional share of that reserve status, the US loses the ability to run these deficits without immediate consequences. Because right now, global demand for dollars is quietly absorbing a ton of inflation that would otherwise show up in your grocery bill, your rent, your gas. As that absorption shrinks, all of that reaches you faster and harder, and it does not reverse. This is the invisible backdrop behind every number we cover today. Keep that in mind as we go through the rest of these. Sign 2 is one I want you to watch very carefully over the next 12 to 18 months because it is approaching a critical point. And that is the commercial real estate crisis. This has been building since the pandemic permanently changed how people work, and it is reaching a place where it cannot be papered over anymore. Office vacancy rates across major American cities have hit nearly 20% nationally. We have not seen levels like that since the savings and loan crisis in the early 1990s. In some downtown markets that were packed 5 days a week before 2020, vacancy is now sitting above 25, even 30%. The buildings are still there. The debt on those buildings is still on the books, but the tenants and the rent checks that were supposed to service that debt are gone. Here is where it becomes a systemic problem, not just a real estate problem. Over $1.5 trillion in commercial real estate loans are coming due by the end of 2026. These were written when property values were elevated, rates were near zero, and office demand looked permanent. None of that is true anymore, and the banks holding this debt, mostly regional institutions already under stress, are going to face a serious moment of truth when those loans need to be refinanced. Regional banks hold about 70% of all commercial real estate debt in the country. When those properties cannot service the debt anymore, those banks start taking losses. We already saw a preview in 2023 when several regional banks failed because of exposure to interest rate-sensitive assets. That was the warning shot. The bigger wave is still coming. Sign 3 comes straight from the government's report, and it is one of the most revealing single numbers in the entire document. Total U.S. debt has reached 99% of GDP. That means the total amount this country owes is now basically equal to everything the entire U.S. economy produces in a full calendar year. Think about it like this. If your total outstanding debt equaled your entire annual income before you paid a single bill, you would be in serious trouble. There is almost no room left for anything to go wrong. And at this ratio, debt starts crowding out everything else. Interest payments take priority. Infrastructure, emergency response, social programs, all of it gets compressed because the first obligation every year is just servicing old debt. This is why the Trump administration has been pushing so hard on the Federal Reserve to cut rates. Because at 99% debt to GDP, high rates do not just slow things down, they accelerate the spiral. Every additional fraction of interest applied across the entire debt stack makes the problem bigger and faster. And here is something to really think about. If we had another pandemic right now and they tried to do the same thing as 2020, those stimulus checks would need to be 3 or 4 times larger just to buy you the same amount of stuff. At current debt levels, a response that size would likely trigger a bond market crisis almost immediately. The tools to respond to the next major shock are already depleted before the next shock arrives. Sign 4 is where the report stops being uncomfortable and becomes genuinely alarming. The long-term projection, their projection, shows national debt on a path to reach 576% of GDP. Not 99%, 576%. They ran their own numbers, their own methodology, their own economic assumptions. The output was 576% of GDP. And then they published it and kept moving, like that is just a number we all know and then get on with our day. This is not an outside economist running worst-case scenarios. This is the government's own budget analysts saying, here is where this ends up if nothing changes. And the political system essentially guarantees nothing changes until it absolutely has to. Because no politician is going to impose real pain today for stability 3 decades from now. They kick the can. They make it the next person's problem. The trajectory keeps compounding. Sign 5 is the day-to-day operational reality of the federal budget right now. We are spending $1.8 trillion more every single year than we bring in through revenue. That gap has to be covered somehow. Borrowing, printing, or taxing. Usually all 3 at once. Think of it like a household that earns decent money but consistently spends way more than it makes every month and puts the rest on a credit card. Every year the balance grows. Every year the minimum payment gets bigger. And every year there is less capacity to handle anything unexpected without making things worse. In the short term, everything keeps running. Programs are funded, benefits keep flowing, the economy does not take an immediate hit. But you are consuming tomorrow's resources to pay for today. And tomorrow always arrives. Every dollar pumped into the system beyond what the economy actually produced pushes inflation. And this is not an accident. The Fed's official target is 2% inflation per year. They want this. It is by design. And it is exactly why when inflation comes down, prices do not come with it. Prices almost never go backwards. They reset higher and stay there. Then the next cycle pushes them higher again. That is the system working exactly as intended. Sign 6 reveals that the headline deficit number is actually understated. The real figure is closer to $2.1 trillion, not 1.8. When the government reports the deficit publicly, the focus is on current year spending against current year revenue. What gets left out are future obligations already locked into the system. Pensions, healthcare, benefits not yet due, but already guaranteed to people who are alive right now and have been paying into these programs their whole careers. Bring those into the accounting, and the number jumps to $2.1 trillion. And those obligations do not go away. They show up on schedule, and funding them means more borrowing, more printing, more taxes. Not as a maybe, as a near certainty. Sign 7 is a number that hit me hard when I found it in the report. Interest on the national debt increased by $78.8 billion in just 1 year, not the total interest bill. The year-over-year increase alone, in 12 months, interest is now one of the fastest growing expenses the federal government has. And think about what that means in concrete terms. Tax money that could go toward roads, schools, veterans, disaster response. It is going towards servicing old debt instead. Not funding anything new, just paying the tab on past decisions made by people who are no longer in office. And because total debt keeps growing and rates have stayed elevated, this compounds. More debt times higher rates means the interest bill accelerates. That creates a feedback loop that is very difficult to break. Debt generates interest. Interest requires more borrowing to cover. More borrowing creates more debt. More debt creates more interest. Every lap around that loop makes things a little worse. And every serious tax conversation in Washington right now, this is a major driver of it. Sign 8 is the number that should dominate every financial news cycle and somehow gets maybe 30 seconds on a slow day. Social Security and Medicare are underfunded by 88 trillion. Not billion. Trillion. 88 trillion. That is the gap between what these programs have promised people and what they actually have the capacity to deliver. The basic math is not complicated. There are fewer workers per retiree today than at any point in the history of these programs. And that ratio gets worse every year as the population ages. Costs are rising faster than the payroll taxes and premiums feeding the system. And there is no version of closing an $88 trillion hole that does not cost somebody something significant. Social Security specifically is on track to hit insolvency within 6 years at the current trajectory. At that point, it can only pay out what it collects in real time from current workers, which works out to roughly 75 to 80 cents on every dollar of promised benefits. For people who built their entire retirement plan around those full payment levels, that is a devastating cut, and the options to fix it are all painful. Raise the retirement age, increase payroll taxes, reduce benefits, some combination of all three. And the longer they wait, the larger those corrections have to be. Sign 9 is about how healthcare and social costs keep climbing on autopilot with no way to slow them down without a major political fight nobody wants to have. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are classified as mandatory spending in the federal budget. That is not just a label, it is a legal designation. These programs run automatically based on eligibility rules and demographics. Congress does not vote on the spending level each year. The spending is determined by how many people qualify and what the rules say they are owed. As the population ages, mandatory spending goes up automatically. No vote required, no policy decision. It just happens because demographics run in one direction, and there is no lever you can pull to slow it without changing the eligibility rules, which is politically nearly impossible. For regular people, this shows up in two specific ways you have already felt. First, health insurance premiums keep rising every year. The premium increases that happened at the start of this year are not a market anomaly. That is what a system looks like when underlying costs keep climbing regardless of what any individual consumer does. Second, payroll taxes tend to go up over time to feed these expanding programs. Every increase means less money you take home from the same hours of work. Sign 10 is the full balance sheet picture, and it is the one that puts everything into context. The federal government carries $47.8 trillion in outstanding liabilities and only $6.1 trillion in assets. That leaves a net position of negative $41.7 trillion. Guys, if this was any business, if this was any household, you would have been forced into bankruptcy decades ago. No lender would touch you. No investor would come near you. The only reason the federal government can sustain this is because it controls the currency and can always create more of it. But that is not free. Every time new money gets created to cover what the system cannot fund otherwise, the purchasing power of every existing dollar decreases. That is where the inflation you feel actually comes from at the deepest level. The dollar has lost the vast majority of its purchasing power since coming off the gold standard back in 1971. That is not an accident. That is the predictable arithmetic of running a balance sheet this negative for this long. Sign 11 is the one that kills the "we will grow our way out of it" argument for good. Beyond the entitlement shortfall, the report shows that total federal spending exceeds total projected revenue by $79.6 trillion over the long term. Even if the economy grows, even if tax revenues increase alongside it, even in the more optimistic scenarios they modeled, the system is built to spend more than it takes in by $79.6 trillion cumulatively. Growth slows how fast the gap widens. It does not close it, because spending is designed to outpace revenue. That is the structure. A lot of people are still waiting for things to normalize, for inflation to settle, for the economy to stabilize, for conditions to feel like they used to. That expectation misunderstands what normal is now. The system is not temporarily stressed and recovering. It is permanently structured to fall further behind. The only way through this is to outperform it individually. Build a margin between your income and your spending that is wide enough to absorb what is coming, because what is coming is embedded in the math. Sign 12 is the final number from the report, and it might be the most telling of all. Federal tax revenue hit $5.2 trillion. That is the highest total in U.S. history, driven partly by higher effective rates and tariff collections that have now been ruled illegal by the courts. $5.2 trillion. A record, and it is still not enough. That tells you everything. When you are collecting more money than ever and it still does not make a dent in the structural problem, the issue is not revenue. The system is designed to spend more than it can ever bring in. And now, with those tariffs being challenged legally and potentially having to be refunded, there is a new hole opening up just as spending keeps rising. The response is predictable. Borrow more. Print more. The $250 billion in additional military spending tied to Iran operations is happening right now, and every dollar of that goes straight onto the debt pile. Bracket creep and currency debasement are the quiet tools they reach for to avoid spooking the bond market, silent taxes that most people never trace back to the source. On top of everything we just covered, the Federal Reserve itself is in serious trouble right now. The Fed just posted $18.7 billion in losses, and this is the third straight year in a row they have lost money, which is historically extraordinary for an institution that used to be one of the most profitable entities on the planet. In 2023, they lost $114 billion. In 2024, that came down to $77 billion. Now in 2026, it is $18.7 billion. The losses are shrinking, but they are still there. 3 years running. The reason traces directly back to the pandemic response. The Fed bought massive quantities of bonds at near zero interest rates to support the economy during the lockdowns. Those bonds pay fixed interest at those low rates. But when inflation surged and the Fed had to raise rates aggressively starting in 2022, suddenly they were paying far more in interest to banks holding reserves than they were collecting from those cheap bonds. The math just stopped working. Here is something most people do not know. Before 2022, the Fed was extremely profitable, and all of those profits went straight back to the Treasury. Between 2012 and 2021, the Fed transferred $870 billion total back to the federal government. That pipeline closed in 2022 and has not reopened. Money the Treasury used to receive automatically, it now has to borrow instead, which feeds directly back into the deficit problem we already covered. This is how far the damage from 2020 actually runs. The emergency decisions made then are still producing consequences in 2026. And it is a reminder that every major intervention has a price that shows up on the back end, sometimes years later, and usually at the worst possible moment. The tools that got used to fight the last crisis are now less available for the next one, and the next one is arriving into a system with significantly less capacity to absorb it than 2020 had. And it is not just the government running this playbook. Regular Americans are increasingly doing the exact same thing, with one massive difference: they do not have a printing press. New data from Experian just dropped, and it tells a clear story. 38% of Americans now carry a personal loan, up from 30.1% back in 2017. There are now over 67.5 million open personal loan accounts in the U.S., with total balances exceeding $207 billion in unsecured debt. And the reason this is happening comes directly from the credit card situation. Total credit card debt in the United States has hit $1.28 trillion. The average credit card APR is sitting around 22%. Personal loan rates average around 11.6%, roughly half. So people are refinancing credit card balances into personal loans to lower their interest costs. And honestly, the math on that move makes sense in isolation. If you are carrying $10,000 in credit card debt at 22%, you are paying $2,200 a year just to service that balance. That same $10,000 on a personal loan at 11.6% costs roughly $1,165 a year. That is almost $1,000 saved annually on interest. The idea is to take that savings and pay the balance down as fast as possible. The problem is that most people consolidate the debt and then immediately start using the freed-up credit again. The breathing room just becomes an invitation to spend more. And now instead of one debt, you have two. Refinancing without changing the underlying behavior is not a solution. It is a reset that usually puts you in a worse position a little later on. Experian also says personal loan inquiries are up 16% year over year. 42% of consumers say they plan to take out a personal loan in 2026. 60% have already used one before. And subprime loan originations jumped 32.5% year over year. These are loans going to people with the least financial cushion. That is not a sign of a healthy credit market. That is a sign of desperation. Now, they will tell you that personal loan delinquencies are still fairly stable at around 4%. Okay, but credit card delinquencies are now at their highest level since 2010. And we all know what 2010 was. That was the aftermath of 2008. People who had been running on credit through an economic collapse finally hit the ceiling of what they could service and stopped paying. The charge-offs followed. The credit market contracted. Recovery took years and cost millions of households everything they had. And right now, with 55% of credit card users carrying balances specifically to cover essential living expenses, not vacations, not luxuries, food and utilities and basic bills, we are seeing the early formation of that same dynamic. Again, I see it in the comments constantly. How do you expect Americans to be financially responsible when the federal government sets the worst possible example every single day? And honestly, that is a fair point. But here's the thing. The government has a mechanism that protects it from the final consequence of this behavior. It controls the currency. It can always create more dollars. It can always extend the runway. You cannot do that. Once you run out of credit and income cannot cover the bills, there is no escape hatch. There is no reserve currency privilege working in your favor, so the behavior that the government gets away with indefinitely will eventually destroy you if you copy it. That asymmetry is the most important thing to understand. The behavior looks the same from the outside. Spend more than you earn. Borrow to cover the gap. Repeat. But the consequences are completely different. The federal government can sustain this because the rules do not apply to the entity that writes the rules. You will eventually hit the wall, and that is exactly why the approach has to be the opposite, not marginally better, fundamentally different. Out-earn your spending by a wide margin. Build a margin that is wide enough to absorb the next inflation surge, the next tax increase, the next cut in public services, because those things are not possibilities on the horizon. They are built into the trajectory. Here is what all of this actually means once you take it all together. The system you are operating inside is not going to fix itself voluntarily. The government's own projections say the current path is mathematically unsustainable. They know it. They published it in a document open to the public. They acknowledged it in writing. And then the same institutions that produced those projections went right back to doing what they always do. That does not mean everything falls apart tomorrow morning. This system has been more resilient than most people expected, and it will probably keep functioning longer than seems rational to anyone looking at the numbers clearly. But the fragility builds with every passing year. The tools available for the next major shock keep getting more limited. The margin for error keeps shrinking, and the 12 signs we just walked through are not predictions about a future that might arrive. They are measurements of a deterioration that is already fully underway. The dollar's reserve share is already falling. The commercial real estate loans are already coming due. Debt is already at 99% of GDP. Interest already jumped 78.8 billion in 1 year. Social Security is already 6 years from insolvency. The Fed has already lost money for 3 straight years. Credit card delinquencies are already at the highest level since 2010. None of this is incoming. It is already here. So the only rational move is to get ahead of it. Earn significantly more than you spend, not marginally more. Significantly. Minimize debt wherever possible. Build real liquid savings. Own assets that hold real value when paper currency keeps losing purchasing power. Gold, silver, productive assets. Things that do not evaporate when the dollar keeps getting diluted, because the people who navigate what is coming are going to be the ones who looked at these numbers, understood what they meant, and made different choices while they still could. The window is still open, but it does not stay open forever. Get ahead of this now. That is the only move that actually works.